So we're already well into the second decade of the Asia century, and power and wealth are fast moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and this means that economically Indonesia will certainly be of vastly greater importance for Australia in the decades ahead. In fact, for some years now, our trade with Asia has been consistently growing at twice the rate of trade with the rest of the world. By 2020, Asian economies will be half of the world's GDP and will be much larger than the US and Europe combined. But ASEAN countries treated as a bloc are already among our top 3 trading partners. By our, I mean Australia here. It's not widely understood that when you put all the ASEAN countries together as one unit, they're in the top 3. In the years to come, I believe Indonesia will probably have that status in its own right. Indonesia is currently only our 13th or 14th largest trading partner, but Standard & Poor's say that by 2050 it will be among the 5 largest economies in the world. But it will be top 10 within a decade and will have already acquired an additional 90 million consumers by then. It's hard to understand how completely this will change almost everything about our region, and that means it will change Australia as well. As it stands, Indonesia's purchasing power, PPP, parity purchasing power, whatever it is, GDP, is right now already 15% bigger than Australia's. Yes, most Australians know Indonesia has millions more people living in poverty than Australia, but how many realise that on that measure Indonesia is already wealthier than Australia? With a growth 3 times of Australia's, a booming stock exchange, and for all the problems that occur with corruption and with economic policy, nonetheless one of the most stable currencies in Asia through the GFC, Indonesia is on track for the sort of economic performance that transformed China. And unlike China, Indonesia has already made the successful transition from authoritarianism to a more open political system of the kind that better suits Indonesia's fast-growing middle class. Indonesia's middle class matters probably more than any other group in Indonesia. After all, Australians need to remember that the middle class in Indonesia is already more in number than the entire population of Australia. Indonesia also matters to Australia from a strategic point of view. Geography means Indonesia will always be crucial to Australia's defence planning. But Australians often forget that Indonesia is as much a shield as a threat in defence terms. In fact, it really is not a threat but a shield. It is the key to Australia's responses to a whole range of security issues, from Islamist terrorism to piracy to narcotics trade. Indonesia's huge expanse of 17,400 islands plus, stretched over a region wider than Moscow to almost Dublin, also makes Indonesia the key to refugee movement and regular migration in our region. Australia has no workable regional solution to the people smuggling problem, chiefly because Australia, as the main regional destination country, has offered no really serious incentives to Indonesia, the main transit country, to do for us what we don't want to do ourselves, namely accept asylum seekers. There won't be a solution until Indonesia is front and centre. Likewise, rising competition between China and the US means Indonesia's control of the deep sea lanes vital to trade and naval movements in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, Makassar Straits and Lombok Straits, will give it added regional influence. Indonesia is the Southeast Asian superpower. Its recent efforts to transform ASEAN into a more meaningful regional bloc that it will dominate shows this process has already begun. It's got a way to go yet, but the process has begun. If China's growth leads to security, instability and military activity in our region, and I'm certain it will, there has been no rising power with imperial ambitions in world history that hasn't used warfare to reach that, and I doubt that China will be an exception. When that happens, Indonesia will become not just a partner for Australia, but also a strategic and diplomatic buffer. Yes, Australians live in the Far East, but they need to remember that it is in fact Australia's near north. Unfortunately, Indonesia remains an almost invisible country for most Australians, present company accepted, of course. And when Indonesia is visible, Australians only notice things in Indonesia that are all about Australia. For example, the Bali bombings and terrorist attacks, Australians in drug cases, we have a long supply of those. Abattoir scandals, another tale of woe and misery for Australians. This means that the Australian public routinely misses the really important developments in Indonesia that aren't all about Australia, such as regime change and democratisation. It is in fact worse than that. Most Australians usually misunderstand Indonesia completely, despite a fifth of our population having been to Bali for holidays. This has been demonstrated repeatedly over the last decade in polling conducted by different groups. Lowy, Crosby Textor, Morgan, Aspey. Aspey found, for example, that Indonesia is popularly seen as Australia's greatest threat, and this, while absurd, has strengthened consistently as a perception in the Australian public over the last half-century. In the Lowy polls, for example, Indonesia is rated in Australia's feelings towards other countries, the international thermometer measuring affinity towards countries in the world, as only better than Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan and Burma. In the Crosby Textor survey of countries that are open and trustworthy, Indonesia rated worst, only Saudi Arabia below it. So it is ironic testament to this national failure to understand Indonesia that most Australians have become less likely to know anything about this vast, complex and important country exactly as it democratised and became an open society. Very few ordinary Australians are even aware that Indonesia democratised and pushed the military back into the barracks. Very few know it has liberal, democratic and multi-party elections. Few know that it has the most free and diverse press in East Asia, certainly more diverse than ours. Unfortunately, the negative view of Indonesia usually prevails in Australia. The fact that it is clearly the view of the majority, and all surveys are uniform on that. In fact, it's getting more popular, not less popular, as a perception of Indonesia, that this negative perception has knee-jerk impact when political decisions are made. And this is true regardless of the better instincts of our politicians, many of whom are privately supportive of the bilateral relationship and better understanding. The problem is aggravated by the fact that many who are engaged in the relationship have such a positive view of it that they find it hard to credit the popular levels of misunderstanding about Indonesia that dominate, and so are usually not effective in countering them. This long-standing dichotomy is now highly problematic for Australian policy on Indonesia. It means the government is often isolated from the wider community on Indonesia policy, and the wider community finds Indonesia policy mystifying. As a result, our policy formation in Australia is often influenced by short-term domestic considerations and not long-term strategic interests, as the beef cattle row showed. This makes our diplomacy often unpredictable from an Indonesian perception. In other words, Australia has a somewhat dysfunctional two-speed engagement with Indonesia. Those who are involved directly in dealings with Indonesia, in government, in the private sector, in business, are strongly positive about it and consider it of vital importance. Keating has been vindicated. Both parties now support the relationship. But most Australians fear or dislike Indonesia. Those who are not engaged in the relationship have a very negative perception. Canberra says, and I agree, that the government-to-government bilateral relationship under President Yudhoyono is currently the best it has ever been. It's no accident that our biggest diplomatic post is in Jakarta and Indonesia is our biggest aid recipient. But governments of both parties have all come to see how vital Indonesia is for Australia, but they have utterly failed to bring the public with them on this. This is the really big problem for the bilateral relationship in the years ahead. Our governmental enthusiasm for Indonesia also often leads our policymakers to forget that both Australia and Indonesia have historically always looked north. This means Indonesia looks away from us. And for too long, Australia has looked north past Indonesia to America and Europe. For decades, we neglected and marginalised Indonesia in our popular consciousness as a result of our deep-seated preference for our Western history over our Asian geography. These two things are widely, often unconsciously assumed to be incompatible, when in fact our future depends precisely on demonstrating we can reconcile our Western history with our Asian geography. That is the real challenge. As Australia now struggles somewhat confusedly to deal with this, we have to also deal with the inconvenient truth that Australia already has much less importance for Indonesia than Indonesia does for Australia. It is hard for Australians to accept that Indonesia will matter far more in the world during the Asia century, which, by the way, has started. But that is how it is. Yes, our embassy in Jakarta is our largest overseas post, but that is certainly not true of the Indonesian embassy in Canberra. The other important thing we need to realise in Australia is that the state of the bilateral relationship may actually now be, and it's good now, may well now be as good as it gets for the next 5 years at any rate. The significant government-to-government success we've enjoyed in the relationship is to a great extent a result of President Yudhoyono's personal goodwill towards Australia and his willingness to look south and take us more seriously than any other president in Indonesia's history. That actually is bad news. Have I got time still? Another minute or two? Because Yudhoyono is constitutionally prohibited from running for his third term in 2014, as you all know, and none of the possible candidates will have as positive an attitude or as close and warm an attitude towards Australia as he does. So, with these challenges ahead for the government-to-government relationship for the next 5 years, allowing the coherence of Australian policy on Indonesia to continue to be disrupted and diverted by popular hostility and ignorance will likely lead to bad policy and be damaging for Australia's national interests. The solutions are obvious. We need to do something about Asia literacy. Happy to talk about that one later. Thank you.